Good morning, everyone. Once again, I'm Jennifer Dietz, Director and Associate Dean for Stanford Continuing Studies. Thank you all for joining us today for Discover Stanford for You. We are very excited to bring you this event. It's our second in our series and is being co-sponsored by Continuing Studies and by the Office of External Relations. Our featured speaker today is Dr. Victor Carrion, who will be sharing insights on early life stress and resilience. This presentation will run about 20 to 25 minutes, and we will be taking questions from the audience afterward. You can type your questions into the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, and you will also be able to vote for the questions you would most like answered. Today's event will close with reflections from writer and former Stanford Dean, Julie Lythcott-Haims. But first to begin, I'd like to introduce Matthew Tews. He's the Associate Vice President for Campus Engagement, and he'll be sharing some thoughts on Stanford's history and values. And go ahead, Matthew.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. And thank you all for joining this morning. It is a great pleasure to be with you. So as Jen said, I'm going to be sharing some thoughts this morning about Stanford's history and values and about what that means for us as we move forward. And I'm going to just start by sharing some slides with you. Okay. So the story of Stanford is a really particular story. And what I'd like to share with you this morning are my reflections and the university's reflections about what that story means and how we draw on it as we think about moving forward. As we reflect on Stanford's history, one of the things that I've been reflecting on quite a bit is that there are many ways to tell this story. And one way is to really think about the university as a part of a much larger world, a larger ecosystem, a larger national and international history, and certainly a history of the natural world and of this incredible natural environment that we find ourselves in, and a history of the North American West and the complex and interesting history of the way that this part of the world evolved. Another way to tell this story is the story of the people who have lived here. And as many of you know, our campus is located within the traditional territory of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. And over thousands of years, the Ohlone people left tangible signs across their homelands. And Stanford cares for many of those sites today. The university and the Muwekma Ohlone tribe today are partners in community-led archaeology, historic interpretation, and a native plant garden. But if we're talking about the story of Stanford as an institution, a really important component of that story is that it starts with a tragedy. As many of you know, the story of Leland and Jane Stanford is the story also of the death of their only son, Leland Jr. So Leland Stanford served as California's governor and as a senator. He devoted to the university the fortune that he had earned, first by supplying provisions to the 49ers mining for California gold, and later as one of the big four whose Central Pacific Railroad laid tracks eastward to meet the Union Pacific and complete the Transcontinental Railway. Leland and Jane had no children until after 18 years of marriage, they finally had a child, a son, in 1868, when Jane Stanford was 39. And then tragedy struck. And I find this telegram that Jane Stanford sent to her friend Mary Hopkins so moving. Our darling son was taken from us this morning after an illness of 3 weeks with typhoid fever. Pray for us. In 1884, Leland Stanford Jr. died at the age of 15. And in 1885, Leland and Jane Stanford founded a university in memoriam to their son. They decided that they were going to use their wealth and their privilege to do something for other people's children in recognition of their son. And so from the beginning, this institution was founded with intention, with a really specific sense of purpose. Leland and Jane Stanford decided to create a university that was from the outset untraditional, coeducational, in a time when most private universities were all male, non-denominational, when most universities were associated with a particular religious organization, and practical, producing cultured and useful citizens, as they said in the founding grant. The founding grant states specifically that the university's objective is to qualify its students for personal success and direct usefulness in life, and that its purpose is to promote the public welfare by exercising an influence on behalf of humanity and civilization. So this was an institution that was Western, that was forward-looking, that was founded with a sense of mission and a desire to have good come out of tragedy. And at the university's opening in 1891, which you see here, Jane Stanford wrote, "It was born in sorrow, but has now become a great joy to our lives." It opened with about 555 students. And shortly after the university's opening, Leland died. This led to a season of financial instability for Stanford, and Jane used her personal fortune to support the university until the assets of the Leland's estate were released from probate. She continued to play an active role in the university's affairs, focusing financial resources on the physical plant and exercising a profound influence on university matters until her death in 1905. Much has happened since then in the life of the university. But I think we go back to that founding moment and its sense of intention, its sense of purpose, and its sense of values as we think about the life of the university and about the future of the university. So one thing that happened in the life of the university was a very major earthquake. And in fact, we've had two major earthquakes, but the earthquake in 1906 was devastating. Magnitude 7.9 earthquake, it struck the San Francisco Peninsula, leaving the campus badly damaged without power, water, or heat, and obviously also devastating for the entire Bay Area. And one thing that happened in that was that the community really came together. The community of students and faculty came together to help clean up the campus, to help move the university forward. And Stanford students also volunteered to help in the nearby communities from San Francisco to San Jose. And despite losing over 1 million square feet of buildings, Stanford rose to the challenge of this earthquake and became an international leader in earthquake studies. So in the crucible of this tragedy, the university drew on its values, its sense of purpose, its sense of usefulness, its sense of contribution to the public welfare. And it did so, and this is important, using the special assets of the university: research, discovery, learning, becoming a center of earthquake studies so that we can actually make the world a better place through contributing to mitigating damage in the future. And that sense of mission and purpose and that sense of intention in our community is something that really guides us today. The course of the 20th century saw many innovations. Obviously, there was an incredible push under engineering professor Frederick Terman, who many people call the founder of Silicon Valley, to leave his stamp by encouraging Stanford students not only to develop, but also to make useful their ideas out in the world, and many research advances. One of the things that happened was the creation of the dish, which many of you might know, the radio telescope that's a familiar landmark in the foothills behind campus. And to me, this is a great symbol of the way that the university is very embedded in its community. This is a research an instrument that allows for incredible high-level institutional research, but it also becomes an icon for the community and a place where many of you may find a path up to walk to, a path to run around. 2,000 people per day before COVID came and enjoyed the space around the dish. And it's an example of the way that the university is really embedded in the broader universe outside of the institution. The history of the university also has its challenges. And like many institutions in recent years, we have been asked to reflect on aspects of Stanford's story that are out of step with those values that I talked about earlier. In particular, as the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion becomes ever clearer in our society, we've been asked to reflect on elements of the university's history that are not in sync with those values. And as many of you know, we have been asked to reflect on names on our campus: the Hunebro Serra name, the David Starr Jordan name. And those have been complex and difficult processes and difficult decisions. And as we make those decisions, we look again to our sense of values, and we look to our mission and our goals as a research institution to have evidence-based processes that allow us to move forward education and that allow us to really manifest our values in ways that are appropriate for our community. And we did make changes in response to those processes. And here we see Jane Stanford Way, which is now the name of the front road on our campus, as a new manifestation of our commitment to the broader goals of equity, diversity, and inclusion that are so important to our community today, and a process that's grounded in our mission, in our research and teaching and educational mission. As we look at the future, we are really reminded of these values and of our mission as a research and teaching institution. And we're also reminded, coming out of COVID, about how much we are part of a global system. Stanford has obviously been incredibly impacted by this pandemic, but the world that we work in has also been incredibly impacted. And as we think about where we're going to land coming out of this, we look to these values coming out of our history. A sense of purpose, of usefulness, of the public welfare, of the way that we can use our research and teaching and discovery to make the world a better place. And we want to be increasingly mindful about this place of Stanford's story in the much larger story of the world around us. And you're going to hear more about that from other speakers today. So thank you very much for joining. I really appreciate it. The institution really appreciates it. And now let me turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Matthew, for that introduction. It really highlights the resilience and adaptation to tragedy that the university has had. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And in the same way that Matthew was saying that we are embedded in the community, we will see in this chat that we are going to have how important connectedness is as we adapt and recover from the stressful experiences we've had. If I can have the first slide, please. Next slide, please. Today, I'm going to introduce the concept of stress, and we're going to talk about the biology of it. We'll start talking about a hormone, cortisol, that is secreted when we have stress and the impact of that hormone on brain development, specifically brain structure and brain function. This will lead us into a discussion of neuroplasticity and how our brain really is active in constant communication with our environment. And I'll give some examples of how we have taken advantage of that to develop some treatment and some prevention interventions that help with that neuroplasticity. And at the end, if we have some time, we will practice some of the cognitive and emotional exercises that we utilize in those interventions. Next slide, please. The first thing to know, especially after we all have had a number of stressors this year, is that we didn't come to this with no stress or no stressors. So we all carry like a backpack, really, where we have all of our experiences of our life. And most of the time we can manage in the same way that we regulate our temperature. We actually can regulate the amount of stress we experience, and our physiology adapts to that. In fact, at the beginning, when stress is not as high, we can see in this inverted U-curve shape that stress is actually helpful for health, for happiness, for performance. We call this eustress, right? Even our immunology system develops, needs some stressors to be able to develop appropriately. But these benefits only go to an optimal point. After that area of optimal stress, what we see is that we really fall into an area that impacts our physiology in a negative way. In that way, then affecting our health, our happiness, our performance. And this second part of the curve is what we call traumatic stress. And we'll give some examples about that. Next slide, please. So here we have an example of a child drawing. This child has experienced war, and this negative experience has taken over a fundamental developmental activity of the child, which is play. We can see in the faces that he draws that these are faces of horror. So the play is not joyful. It also tends to be repetitive. And war is one of those things that we call a man-made traumatic event. But we also have some natural disasters. So next slide, please. This is another example of a man-made event, 9/11, from the eyes of a child as well. Next slide. And then we have natural disasters. This is a 4-year-old drawing after an earthquake in Haiti, demonstrating how she and her sister were the only survivors in the rubbles. Next slide, please. Interpersonal violence is the term that we utilize for physical abuse, sexual abuse, witnessing violence, and much of our research and the information that I'm sharing with you today comes from this type of trauma. Next slide, please. And of course, we have events like the one we all have gone through this year, which started as an acute stressor, but then became chronic. And as we mentioned before, this doesn't mean that this was the only experience that we had. A lot of individuals had other experiences in addition to this, making that backpack a lot heavier. And if you're a little child and you have a very heavy backpack, you may fall backwards. So how do we protect ourselves? How do we protect our children? How do we protect our community from these experiences? Next slide. So that we can achieve the resilience that we need. Well, the whole battle between nature and nurture is pretty much over. We know that it is the interaction of genes and environment that determine our vulnerability to stress, and also how we respond to it in terms of developing conditions like anxiety or depression, or having resilience. And resilience is a physical term, right? It means that it represents a coil returning back to its original state. So in resilience is our attempt to return to our normal function. But I'm going to introduce the concept of adaptation, which means that we actually adapt to the changes that are present, and we bounce not to where we were, but we bounce to another state that may be even better and better prepare for when things happen in the future. So it's important to have both of these concepts in mind. Next slide, please. So what happens when this hormone that I was mentioning, cortisol, gets secreted? And there's a lot happening in the central nervous system. As we are developing 100 billion neurons, are forming trillion of synapses. There's a lot of activity. There's pruning, getting rid of those networks that we're not using as much, and myelination to increase the conduction of the nerve cells in our brain. Next slide, please. Well, let me tell you a little bit about cortisol. It doesn't get released from the brain. It actually gets released from the adrenal cortex in the adrenal glands on top of our kidneys. Is the final result of a hormonal axis that does begin in the brain. So the stress is experienced by our autonomic nervous system, and then through this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, just all the different glands that are involved in this, we secrete cortisol. And that's a good thing, because if we're crossing the street and a truck is coming at us, we want that cortisol to go high. We want epinephrine to go high because it helps us jump out of that dangerous situation. But what happens when you're 6, 7, 8, or an adult, and you feel like a truck is coming at you every day? That has a cost. And part of that cost is the sensitivity of this system and the dysregulation of this system. Next slide, please. In our research, we have found that high levels of cortisol before bedtime are very characteristic of children that experience post-traumatic symptoms. And this is of concern because we know from animal research that the analog of cortisol, corticosterone, actually can be toxic to vulnerable cells in the brain as they are developing. Next slide, please. So one of the things we wanted to see is how is this release of cortisol that can potentially be neurotoxic during that second half of the curve of stress, during traumatic stress, really impact the development of key areas of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex, where we actually execute our functions of organization and attention, the executive function, if you will, of the brain, and then limbic areas of our brain, like the amygdala, the heart core of emotion in the brain, and the hippocampus, which helps process our memories. Both of these regions have a lot of receptors for cortisol. Next slide, please. One of the things that we identified was that, in fact, the function of areas like the hippocampus were not as healthy as that function in the healthy children that we use as a control group. And what we see here is increased activity. What we see here in yellow is increased activity of the hippocampus in a memory task above the activity that we see in children that have post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Next slide. And here we have it illustrated in a voxel manner, the higher column really demonstrating increased activity of the hippocampus, better memory processing, if you will, in kids that are healthy and don't have that traumatic stress that we are talking about. Next slide, please. And we have found that also in the prefrontal cortex, there are areas like the ventromedial part of the prefrontal cortex that have an impact in the development of their structure and their function with high levels of cortisol as well. Next slide, please. What we see here then is that when we compare again children that have experienced trauma and have post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress symptoms, in comparison with children that are healthy and have not had these stressful experiences, there's a very early increased activity on the amygdala when presented with an emotional stimulus. Now, the amygdala usually, like I said, is the emotional core of the brain. Usually it has a break in the prefrontal cortex to control the activity of that amygdala. But when we look, next slide, please, at the activity of the prefrontal cortex is not working as effectively. And one of the potential mechanisms is that neurotoxicity that has happened in key regions of the prefrontal cortex due to the high levels of cortisol. Next slide, please. So what this all tells us is, and this is like one side of the coin only, right? But what this tells us is that the environment impacts our biology. And I have presented here a scenario where when that environment is negative and stressful and traumatic, the impact that it has. But what happens if we actually work on that environment so that the impact in the biology is more favorable? Could we make a change? Could we improve those pathways and make them resilient and make them healthy? Well, one good thing about our brain is that those areas that we've been talking about, the cortical areas, the prefrontal cortex, and the limbic areas like the amygdala and the hippocampus are very plastic. That means that they really can change. And neuroplasticity, next slide, please, is something that we can really take advantage of during development because it's very active during that time. And things that we do that are favorable and that we will talk about, like aerobic exercise, can promote that neurogenesis. And not only that, it's even better for regions like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So how can we utilize that? Well, what we've done, next slide, please, is that we have developed treatments that enhance the activity of that prefrontal cortex and of that limbic system. So a psychosocial intervention, a therapy, if you will, that enhances emotion regulation and also executive function. And we call that cue-centered therapy. And here we can see in a number of sessions, in 13 sessions, the decrease of symptoms of PTSD as the sessions progress. But since we did neuroscience work for the rest of the work, we wanted to also find some evidence, neuroscientific evidence, that this intervention actually was serving this function. And on the next slide, what we see is that there's an area of the brain, next slide, please, thank you, that where we see decreased activity of an area of the prefrontal cortex that usually is very activated during symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this methodology is called functional near-infrared spectroscopy. We actually, it's not an MRI, we actually can see the activity that happens in the cortical areas of the brain. And it gives us information, it gives us empirical evidence of the good function that this intervention is having. Next slide, please. So that's for children that have PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. What about children that are at risk of experiencing trauma? Could we do some prevention, some health promotion, some protection in the brain for when they have these stressful experiences? And I just mentioned that exercise is very helpful in terms of neurogenesis. Are there ways in which we can exercise both our body and our mind together at the same time? Well, yes, there are. And one of those is a curriculum put out by Pure Edge Inc., who we collaborated to develop this curriculum called Pure Power that has been disseminated in school districts. Is a curriculum on yoga and on mindfulness. Next slide, please. And we compare this, we actually have assessed the efficacy of this with a neuroscientific approach as well. And today what I want to talk to you about is sleep and its impact on sleep. Next slide, please. We process the events of the day, traumatic or not, during deep sleep. And also, so it is very important to have good quality sleep. What we see here is that when children start the yoga and mindfulness curriculum, their total sleep time increases. And not only that, next slide, please, but also the rapid eye movement part of the brain also increases. And this is important because a lot of that neurogenesis that we were talking about happens during that particular phase of rapid eye movement. Next slide, please. In terms of activity of the amygdala, I mentioned first how the amygdala is hyperactivated when there's fear, when there's anxiety, and when there's aggression. What we've seen is a decrease of this activity. If we look at the green columns here, before the intervention and after the intervention. So the intervention has the power to decrease that amygdala activity. And this is something that we didn't see in the control group. Next slide, please. So this brings us back to, well, what is in those interventions? Can I share anything with you? And I want to share two pieces of information and maybe some practice as well. One is the importance of positive thoughts. Part of anxiety and part of depression is having a lot of negative thoughts. We call these thoughts also automatic thoughts because evolution has taught us that it has served us well at some point to have negative thoughts. Like, for example, if we were afraid of the lions coming after us, we better get on that tree. and to have that sense of hypervigilance. So that precaution, that caution, that alarm system is very ingrained in our brains for millions and millions of years. Positive thoughts is something that comes out more of our prefrontal cortex. And this is younger, this is only like 50 million years old. So positive thoughts are not automatic. The best way to fight negative thoughts is with positive thoughts, because sometimes, although I just gave an example of how negative thoughts can be adaptive, the fact that they happen automatically means that sometimes they're going to be maladaptive. Sometimes we may worry for no reason or have negative thoughts for no reason. So it is important then to bring positive thoughts, but those are not automatic, so we need to practice them. And many of these interventions help with the improvement of the development of positive thoughts, and that improves executive function and function of the prefrontal cortex and helps alleviate anxiety and depression. In terms of emotion regulation, mindfulness really means being in the present moment in a non-judgmental way, appreciating what's happening. And this is something that children do naturally all the time, but as we get older, we become more busy and we kind of lose it. We still teach children to maintain this state of mindfulness, and we use breathing as an anchor to the moment. It also helps with muscle relaxation. By increasing the depth of your breath, you bring more oxygen, which helps relax the muscle further. Next slide, please. So, it's interesting when people talk about breathing, because we are really breathing all the time, right? Breath equals life. I mean, we need to breathe to live. But sometimes we don't breathe as deep as we can. So an exercise on mindfulness and yoga and breathing is to really increase the depth of that breath. So calculate, for example, when you're breathing in and when you're breathing out, how deep is that? A count of 1, a count of 2, breathing in, 1, 2, breathing out, 2, 1. And one good exercise is to really try to get to that 5. So breathing in, breathing out, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. For children, it's helpful to attach this to a visual stimulus, and we have an exercise called the starfish. And the starfish is basically the hand, and you breathe in when you're going up one of your digits, and you breathe out when you go through another one. So you breathe in, and you breathe out. You breathe in, and you breathe out. And this is something that kids, very young kids, can really understand and enjoy exercising. And then when you get to the 5th, you come back. So you do it twice. For us adults, sometimes an exercise on mindfulness and to pay attention to the moment is to really take a moment to see 5 things that we can actually see at that moment, 4 things that we can hear, 3 things that we can touch, 2 things that we can taste, and 1 thing we can smell. We activate our senses this way. And not only we activate them, but we become more aware of them. And then very simple poses in yoga, like the mountain pose, can be very helpful as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the stressor that we have all experienced and how this stressor of the pandemic is characterized by isolation, by health risk, by family stress, and the importance to bring resources like the ones we've talked about and coping skills to children, young adults, to everyone, really. And it's important to have coping skills. We can talk more about these during the discussion, but also engaging in self-care, right? The right sleep, the right diet, exercise, the practice of the positive thinking, the mindfulness, the not abusing drugs and alcohol, the seeking the social support, but also being part of the social support and providing academic support for the young ones. So how do we introduce all of this material to our young ones? Well, the first thing they do want to hear is that they're safe, that they're secure, that we feel competent and confident in protecting them, and invite them to a conversation. And they may be ready for it, they may not be ready for it, but at least they know they can come to you if they have a question. It's very important to remain connected, which has been a challenge this year, and we need now during the transition period to regain that connectedness. And it's important also not only to talk about it, but to actually model it, right? To model it ourselves to our youth, because they learn this way as well. So if I can have the next slide, please. I want to thank my team that helped with all of this work. Next slide. And those also that support this work. So thank you very much. We are going to now engage in a discussion. So if you have any questions and comments, please add them to the Q&A or chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor. That was a really thoughtful presentation and gives us so much to think about in terms of understanding how the brain works and how we can support young people and take care of ourselves as we're navigating these really difficult times. So we have quite a few questions lined up, and folks, if you can please add in more, we'll try to get to as many as we can between now and 12:35 or so. The first question, can you please address the ways that teachers may assist students dealing with stress and anxiety?
Yes, so teachers are in a very important place in that they can really control the environment in that classroom and in a very broad way approach all kids at once, not only individually. And some of the exercises that I mentioned have been published. For example, I mentioned Pure Edge. They have a series of what we call brain breaks. And if you go to pureedgeinc.org, you actually can acquire the curriculum there of the brain breaks and apply them to the classroom, and then create an environment that is not for any particular kids specifically, but it's for everybody. Now, the teacher may also recognize that some kids may need more than that, and then it would be important to get a referral for those youth, and also maybe before the referral, try to see if coping skills can be enhanced for that kid with like coping skills like the ones we've been talking about, basically.
And we have a similar question coming in from 3 different places. How do you help young adults and people later in life overcome traumatic experiences or their experiences of PTSD? How do you ameliorate the effects of cortisol decades later?
Yes, so we were talking about resilience earlier, and we know some about resilience. We don't know all about resilience. But one characteristic that comes over and over again in the literature is the presence of an adult in the life of that individual where the child can reflect, right? So being present and being there for them is something that we can really help with, letting them know that they are not alone. In terms of those kids that have really gone through traumatic experiences, there are many things that are important. The first one I will mention is education on the subject. Many kids may feel that they are bad or that they are a problem or that they are weird, right? Because they are experiencing symptoms and they don't know anything about symptoms, right? So it's important to tell them that we, all humans, respond to stress with this kind of responses and normalize the experience to them. Also, in that same education, let them know about the next steps to take. These include developing coping tools to help them manage their emotion, developing responses that are adaptive. Their armamentarium or their toolbox may be very limited. And some of those responses that were adaptive at some point may now be maladaptive, right? So we want to give them and develop with them new responses. And we want to do that before we get into a very important part of recovery. We want to do that before we get into what we call the narrative, which is telling the story, right? What we do during the process of the narrative is that we take those emotional experiences and we refile them again with words that when we retrieve those memories in the future, they will come out as words and not just as an emotional reaction. So we may retrieve a memory of, I went through X, Y, and Z, and I survived it, right? And these were the coping tools that I used. So we want to create that story. We also want to identify cues, identify triggers that were associated with those traumatic experiences. And these are usually neutral things, colors, the rain, whatever, something that may happen in the future that may trigger the body to have that same reaction that it had at the traumatic moment. And then exposure to those cues in a safe environment help as well. So obviously this is a lot of work, right? We don't just tell the kid, go and do this. So we engage with them. And this is basically the principles behind the cue-centered therapy that I mentioned earlier.
Great. And kind of following up on that, there were a couple of questions around neuroplasticity and just wanting to know, does that actually change the brain itself?
Yes, it does. It's very interesting. We always felt that the prefrontal cortex was being very active in its development, and we would say, oh, it's still developing in the teens. Then after that, later in my career, it was like, no, it's still developing in the early 20s. Now we feel like it's developing, throughout life. So yes, it's active. Our brain is in direct communication with our environment. And the better we make our environment, the better our brain becomes.
Great. Next question. Has any of your work investigated the impact of racially based violence on children and youth that have had either primary or secondary exposure? Would you put this in a different category from interpersonal trauma?
Well, I would put it on the category of the backpack, to tell you the truth. We call these microaggressions. Sometimes they are not that micro, right? Sometimes they are very big and they're traumatic events like hate crimes. So you can go anywhere from a microaggression to a hate crime. And for different individuals, depending on the age when they experience them, depending on the severity, depending on the amount, that translates to how much they're carrying on the backpack, right? Depending in terms of resilience, if that adult person, caring person was there for them and helped them process those events. So to answer the question directly, I would say yes. I don't make much distinction of the type of trauma, because that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is going to respond to anything that subjectively and objectively is stressful to the individual.
Great. And we had another question. Can you elaborate on the benefits of CBT, DBT therapies as an intervention?
Yes, so a lot of what I've mentioned today is in cognitive behavioral therapy. Cue-centered therapy is a hybrid of cognitive behavioral therapy with something else that we call insight-oriented therapy, which is mostly about education and also helping children connect what they use. Children compartmentalize a lot. So sometimes they know that something happened, that they have some symptoms and that they're doing these behaviors, but they don't see the connection that because this happened, I developed these feelings that made me do this, which makes me get in trouble now. So that process, insight-oriented therapy, helps with that process. The cognitive component of cognitive behavioral therapy, an example is that positive thinking that I was talking about, and how to really fight the negative thoughts. And then the behavioral aspect is the exposure aspect that I talk later on that. The DBT enhances all of this with more support for those that need more support, and also includes elements of group work and also of availability, therapeutic availability.
Great. And I had a question. Can you share more about how you partnered to develop a curriculum for children and how widely it is used?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. Running a team that works on stress and trauma, I became many years ago very concerned about my own team and what is it like to work in a place where you're seeing trauma all the time. Vicarious traumatization is real. So I wanted to make sure that we were all protected. And that's how mindfulness and yoga came into our team through one of our members and one of our therapists that had that expertise. It was so helpful, and we actually liked it so much that we took it to a school in East Palo Alto where we were doing some work. And the principal wanted to know what was going on in that classroom because she had not seen anyone in her office from that classroom for the past 7 months. So we decided to do a pilot study in some of the grades, and the News Hour actually got hold of this and had a piece on our implementation of yoga and mindfulness in schools. And the Sonima Foundation saw that clip and then collaborated with us and collaborated with the school district to develop the study that I presented that had the results on sleep. So it's being in the right place at the right time, but also with the right information and the right equipment. So one reason why we do these studies is so that we actually can tell educators we do have data that this actually improves sleep or improves brain function.
And next question is, one of the reasons why being outdoors is helpful in reducing stress because it helps with being open to all of our senses? And if so, are there any other reasons why being outdoors is so valuable for children and adults?
Well, I'm sure there's tons of reasons. I love being outdoors. I feel very connected. I feel as human beings, we are nature, right? So if we're enclosed in a building, we are not connected with part of who we are. So when we go out, we connect with nature, but I do like this idea of how active the senses are when we are in nature. I had not thought about that, but it's true, right? To the extreme, to the point that we may get poison oak or something. But this are really involved, and I think that is a good thing. I think another thing is the actual exercise, the actual hiking, right? That happens. Or swimming or whatever might be very helpful as well.
And do you know of any research correlating early childhood trauma with incidences of OCD?
Yes, interesting question. So we think of trauma as a stressor to the system for the individual to develop anything they may be vulnerable to. So think of a threshold model, right? Where only after you reach a certain point, some genes may become activated. And that gene environment connection, which we now call epigenetics, results in the expression of what the individual was going to be developing. So when do you reach the threshold? Well, it's going to be different for different individuals. For some of them, it might be very early in their life. For others, it might be things like going to college, right? Positive experiences can also be stressful. And so it's not only necessarily PTSD. So that's a very good question. We use PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as an anchor, but environment and environmental stressors play a role in all psychiatry and psychological conditions.
And another person asks if you could talk about collective trauma and how we as humanity can cope with that.
Yes, I recently blogged on Psychology Today about the 7 stages of Q-center therapy and how we as a nation need to go through them. after the year that we've had. Because not only we were experiencing the pandemic, we experienced a lot of political divisions, we experienced a lot of racial issues and trauma, and then the natural culprits were still there, right? The natural disasters, the fires. So it's a lot. And my point on the blog was, on Psychology Today, was if little kids can do it and they can go through this, we as a nation should be able to do this. We should be able to educate, right, our citizens on the impact of trauma. We should be able to develop coping tools by strengthening our institutions, in art, in health, in education, in all of those. We should have our storytellers, our artists, and our journalists really narrate with us the experience that we went through, so that we don't forget about it and we actually learn from it, and so forth. So yes, I do very much believe that we experience collective trauma, not only in the United States, but in the world.
And another person asks, do coping methods differentiate according to each person and their specific personality? Would one person's method for PTSD be different than for someone else?
Yes, so that is very interesting. There's some individuals that you actually teach them to relax and they feel worse. So relaxation is not good for them. And that's why when we work with kids or adults and we're developing a coping tools, they decide, right? We teach them tools, but they decide if this is something they're going to bring on or not. And many times they are really encouraged to bring tools that we are not teaching them, things that have helped them, playing guitar, listening to music, swimming, drinking a glass of milk. I mean, it can be so many different things for different people. So yes, it is very personalized. It's an example of personalized medicine. In the CCT, for example, when we talk about a response, we talk about it as a square with 4 corners: what we feel physically, what we think, and what we do. These are all elements of any response that we take. And one of the things that makes CCT flexible is that some children are more apt to start working in one corner rather than the other, right? So it's a very brainy kid. We start with the thought. If it's very active, we start with what you actually do. So yes, it is different for different people.
Okay, great. Another person asks, can someone have self-inflicted PTSD even on a minor scale? For instance, the traumatic incident in question was caused by an incident brought on by the person's own actions. And what would you say if PTSD was on a minor scale in terms of nightmares or subtle anxiety, but it was basically brought on by that person?
Yeah, I think it depends. I think many times what we are trying to do is to make ourselves feel better. And what we do is that we actually engage in behaviors that may play a role of self-medication in a way. If we at an early age don't recognize, or at any age really, don't recognize that we are experiencing symptoms of trauma, we're going to have an impulse to do things that make us feel better. And sometimes these are not really adaptive, right? Sometimes there can be issues like substance abuse or injurious behaviors that then, yes, may increase the experience, the traumatic experience. So it is important to seek professional help when one feels that one is in a situation like that. And I wanted to make sure that I mentioned some resources. I'll add them. Should I add them to the chat or the Q&A after?
Into the Q&A would be great if you're able to access that.
Okay, because
if not, we can get it transferred over.
Yeah, there's the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, for example, has a section called Facts for Families at acap.org. That's very helpful. StanfordChildren's.org has a lot of information as well. And also the National Child Traumatic Stress Network can be very helpful. And for adults, the ISTSS, International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies.
Great. And folks were also looking for the link for brain breaks and wondering if you had other tips you could share for engaging the five senses.
So that's pureedgeinc.org.
Okay, perfect.
There's another exercise, which is eating a raisin. Of course, find out for allergies first. Make sure that there are no allergies to raisins. But sometimes we eat things without thinking. So mindful eating means let's eat this raisin very slowly, introducing all of our senses. What does it look like? Does it have any smell? What's the texture when we put it in our lips? What happens? What happens when we taste it, and so forth. So yeah, there.
That's great. Question: what is the scientific evidence, not of animal but of human, that stress is linked to the developmental issues such as malnutrition?
So there's ample evidence about the impact of stress. There's just a lot of information on that, and there's also ample information about the role of genes, right? But what both have decided is that gene environment interactions are really involved in many of the conditions that we see. And some have more penetrance than others. I mean, some are really more environmentally induced than others, and some are really more genetic than others. But it's really a conversation between those two.
Yeah.
I would welcome this individual to look at the literature on epigenetics, because if you look at impact of stress, you're going to be overwhelmed. Epigenetics, it tells you where the field is now in terms of environmental that activates genes, and genes that may not need any other environmental input to be expressed, and so forth.
Okay. Another person asks, can you share what is known about adoption and the child's sense of stress or PTSD?
Yeah, it depends. It depends what the experience was before the adoption. If it was a positive experience before the adoption, then there's maybe not that much there. So it depends. It's very individual. One of the things that there's a checklist of what we call adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, that includes divorce as a stressor, for example, or experiences maybe like adoption. And I'm not particularly thrilled about that in there, because sometimes not adopting or remaining in a marriage when you should divorce actually can be more stressful. So it really depends. It really depends. It depends in other factors. Context is very important. So whenever you're wondering, well, is this good? Is this bad? What's going on? Ask yourself, what's the context here, right? So for example, a child leaves a classroom running, right? And gets sent to the principal. And then in the principal's office, he gets expelled or something. But there's no context that a year before that, there was a violence at home, right? And one of the adaptive mechanisms was for the child to run to their bedroom and close the door. So now the body has learned that whenever there's a trigger or a cue that seems like that may be happening again, and the classroom was noisy at that moment, that they will tend to respond the same way. But that context is not there. So we always need to look at context. We also need to look at function, right? We are anxious animals. We all get sad, right, from time to time. How do we know when we are experiencing something that needs further clinical attention? Well, it's important that we look at our function. Is it having an impact on my work? Is it having an impact on my school? Is it having an impact on my relationships? Is it having an impact on my level of distress? If the answer is yes to any of those, then you are dealing with something that may need some clinical intervention.
And along those lines, someone was asking, are there good surrogate measurements of stress? Like, how would you measure it?
Yeah, in terms of research, what we do is we check for cortisol levels and also alpha amylase, which is a measure of the autonomic nervous system. We all have different baseline heart rates. So it depends. Increased heart rate may not necessarily be a good measure unless you're very familiar with your baseline. And then you can see that, yes, that your actually sympathetic system, which makes your heart rate increase, or your hands sweat, is increased.
Okay. And we'll close on this one. It actually came in as a bit of a comment, but I think actually can turn into a question. The end of the school year seems to have given some children a positive view toward a normal summer, while others seem suddenly untethered and in need of urgent psychiatric referral. And particularly if you're a parent and you have children with different reactions, how do you navigate those and best support them?
Yeah, I will be very watchful during this time of transition. I mean, we've all been running this marathon, right? And very much like in a marathon, sometimes we don't fall or our knees don't hurt until we get to the end. And I think it's going to be important to pay attention to, once we feel the relief, some amount of relief, I should say, how are we expressing ourselves? It's also important that we look at our developmental age of our kids. So preschoolers, for example, may manifest difficulties very differently than school age, than adolescents. So for example, preschoolers may regress in terms of their behaviors, become more clingy, right? They may start sucking their thumbs again, things like that. School-age kids may somatize, may have headaches, stomach aches that are otherwise unexplained medically, and adolescents may tend to withdraw. So not only you may have different reactions at home, but you may have different reactions according to their different developmental stages as well.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And just want to let the audience know as well that we will be working to pull together a collection of resources that Dr. Carrion mentioned today, and we will post those to our Continuing Studies website, which you can find at continuingstudies.stanford.edu. And now we'll transition over to hear from Julie Lythcott-Hames, who will share with us some closing reflections.
Jennifer, Megan, it's an honor when your alma mater invites you to come home. So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this marvelous presentation today. And thank you to Victor and Matthew as well. I am grateful to be here in the capacity as an alum, member of the great class of '89. I'm a former campus administrator for 14 years, and now I'm a neighbor of Stanford. I'm here in Palo Alto and 10 to 15 minutes away, given the traffic, and just find myself continually feeling so fortunate to be in a community that happens to contain a world-class research university. I think we all know how fortunate we are to have Stanford in our lives, whether we are physically here or accessing Stanford virtually. Sometimes if we're local, we get annoyed by the traffic and the construction, but let us never let those small annoyances in daily life overshadow the fact that Stanford nourishes the lifeblood, not only of Palo Alto and the San Francisco Bay Area and California, but the nation and the world and our existence as humans. My goodness, how fortunate we are that Stanford is here. My writing and my work is about helping humans. I believe in humans, and I'm just trying to help humans thrive so that they can be who they're meant to be, so that they can become who they want to become in this one wild and precious life. And here I'm quoting the late poet Mary Oliver. So I'm interested in the obstacles that get in the way of humans thriving. And I'm interested whether those obstacles are external or internal. Whatever the obstacles may be, my work tries to be about helping humans remove the obstacles from their path. So I have been delighted, as you all have, to have the chance to learn from Dr. Carrion today, to hear about his work in the field of neuroscience, to learn about some ways we can make interventions to lessen the impact of trauma and that bad kind of stress on us. Because of my work is around, in part, helping parents figure out how can we help our children thrive? How can we improve the quality of their lives? That's what I'm going to briefly focus on in the remaining time. I'm going to just reflect a little bit on what Dr. Carrion has shared and try to offer at the end one practical tip for you. If you are a parent, if you are an educator in the life of a child, one practical thing you can do to try to help that child be more likely to thrive. Look, we all love our kids, right? We all love our kids. I have a 21 and a 19-year-old. I know I adore my kids. I know you do too. And we want what's best for them. The trouble is, in our community, right here in the greater Stanford community and in communities like us around the world, too often we send some pretty specific messages to our kids about success, very narrow messages about a person's worth. And these things may not seem to rise to the level of PTSD that Dr. Carrion was speaking of the trauma that people can experience in life. But I'd wager he would say that these messages, these ways of being with our kids, can create a heaviness in the kid's backpack. I love that metaphor, Dr. Carrion. Too many children in our communities are implicitly, if not explicitly, raised with the message, you are loved when you achieve these things. You are good enough when you do this and that. And they are marched down a path toward those things we value. You need to be good at this. You need to be a this. Oh no, don't study that. Don't be a that. That's not what we value. You need to do this and do this in furtherance of getting there. And then too often kids not only are given those messages, but are then micromanaged toward living that very life someone else has in mind. And the questions then become, have you done this yet? Why haven't you done this yet? When are you going to do this? These are, I think, some form of the harmful messages that Dr. Carrion referred to. And indeed, research from the fields of psychology and neuroscience correlates that these types of parenting behaviors, this micromanagement, this need to handle and direct and fix and plan, that these behaviors are correlated with anxiety and depression in adolescents and young adults. We parents, when we do this, though we love our children so fiercely, we can inadvertently, effectively live their lives for them by doing all this planning and fixing and micromanaging, and effectively deprive them of leading their own life in a very literal but also existential sense. We are depriving them of developing agency and self-efficacy and of developing resilience. And these things can lead to learned helplessness and anxiety and depression. As Dr. Carrion said, our kids need connection with adults, yes, but micromanagement is not a healthy connection. We are taking our kids' agency away, and we have to give their agency back. And we need to build resilience in them too. So here's my hack, my one simple tip that I hope will be useful to those of you who have a child you love in your life. When a kid has a problem, a run-of-the-mill childhood problem, and let's not turn every act of childhood into a catastrophe, right? Things will go wrong. They will struggle, they will fall, they will fail. Those are life's greatest teachers. So I'm not talking about a major disaster happening, but just sort of a run-of-the-mill something didn't go right. Our tendency is often to fix it, right? We want to fix the problem. We want to make it go away. We want to smooth it. We want to make sure the consequence doesn't flow. We want to make things better. But what we're supposed to do to build agency and resilience is empathize with the kid and empower them instead. Instead of fixing, we're supposed to empathize and empower. So I'm going to show you an example. And by the way, you already know how to do this. And I'm going to tell you after the example where you are probably already doing it. So here's the example. Your kid comes home from school, doesn't matter what grade or age, could be kindergarten to graduate school or anywhere in between. And the kid throws down their bag or their backpack and says, well, I guess I failed math. if we're overparenting, if we're micromanaging, we're going to say, what? You studied for that. We studied for that. You know, our future depends on you doing well in this math. How did this happen? How could you have let this happen? And we control by yelling at our kids sometimes, or by picking up the email or the phone and yelling at the teacher. In other words, we've decided we need to do something about this math that has gone wrong. The healthy way of parenting is where we empathize and empower the kid. Instead of freaking out, oh no, what are we going to do? We say, oh no, that must not feel very good. I'm so sorry. It sounds like you're struggling. Do you want to talk about it? These are positive thoughts. You're showing the kid you care. You're expressing love. You're not flipping out and acting like the world ends because they think they're failing math. You might pause, smile on your face. You might hug. The point is, it's the kid's life. When you don't freak out and instead you empathize with what they're going through, you give them room to show up in their life, knowing it is safe to be feeling this way, knowing their parent doesn't think this is a catastrophe, knowing their parent thinks that they can handle it. So you follow up that empathy with, I'm here for you. Let me know if I can help. I'm confident you can figure it out. Now, can I get you a snack? That smile, that offer of a snack, that change of the subject, that gives the child some sense of relief. All right, my parent still loves me. My parent believes that I can handle it. And they are so much more likely to be able to. I said you already know this, and now I'm going to tell you why. You have a niece, you have a nephew, you have a best friend's kid. And when that kid says to you, or you're at their house and they come home and say, well, I think I just failed math. You don't decide to email the math teacher. You just offer compassion, empathy, right? Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that happened. Let me know if I can help. I know a thing or two about that class or that material. Okay, you're already doing it with other people's kids. See if you can do it with your own. When we overparent, we undermine our kids. When we change our way of being, then our kids' skills and mental health can improve. And also we get a bit of our lives back. And that's good too, which is how I'll close. When we get a little bit of time back, instead of micromanaging our kids, now we've got some time, we can focus on building a healthy adult life, which includes engagement with our community and our university. I want to encourage everybody here to stay connected to Stanford through continuing studies, through the arts, through athletics, through open space. So much of it is free, most of it virtual right now, but not forever. Let us continue to let Stanford nourish us. And let us always be there for Stanford. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. These are wonderful ideas as we think about what we can do to help support our kids and make them feel loved, accepted, listened to, and empowered. And I want to thank all of our speakers today for taking the time to come and talk with us, and for the audience in joining in as well. We really appreciate you being here. This was the second Discover Stanford for You event. We plan to host events quarterly next year, so please let us know your thoughts when you receive our survey. You can also reach out to us through our website, community.stanford.edu, and subscribe to the monthly email newsletter, Stanford for You. Finally, please check out our new summer course lineup at continuingstudies.stanford.edu. We look forward to connecting further as we all work together toward a better future. Thank you.